Yeah. Okay. I think we can start. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this panel, where we're going to discuss sustainable infrastructure, the main challenges, but also the opportunities. I'm Charlotte de Winter. I'm heading the infra offer within Private Markets Group at UBP. And I'm going to quickly present our speakers today, and then we can dip into the introduction. It's a pure coincidence, but rare enough to be highlighted. It's a panel of women. And I'm going then to, no offense ladies, to start with a minority today. So Mark Elliott, I have the pleasure of working with you at UBP. You are the energy transition investment specialist. You are leading the equity research with the energy transition, considering the negative and positive exposure to developments, but also technologies and business models. We have Anne Ornoun. After a long career in private banking in Geneva, you are now the chair of the board of TPG, Transport Public Genevois, this state-owned company. The board is responsible for governance, but also for long-term strategy, and that includes sustainable development and transport innovation. We also have today Isidora Costa. So you're leading the infrastructure industry, future of energy, materials, and infrastructure at the World Economic Forum, and you are building collaboration between public and private sector to support the transition of the infra sector towards a more sustainable future. And Jessie Scott, you are a leading expert on European climate, energy policies and politics, based at the Hertie School and the IW in Berlin. Jessie, you've been involved in numerous research projects and publications on decarbonization, gas and electricity markets, and the energy transition in general in Europe. I'm going to dip into the introduction. So, sustainable infrastructure, the essence of infrastructure is to offer long-term, essential service to the community, to the society, over a long run. But today, construction and operations of infrastructure are responsible for around 80% of the emissions. So we're here to discuss sustainability, sustainable infrastructure, and that would be my first question to you, Isidora. What is the definition of sustainable infrastructure? Why is it crucial that infrastructure become more sustainable, but also more resilient to face climate changes?
Thank you, Charlotte, and I'd like to mention that it's a pleasure to be here at this panel, at this event. So I'll start by saying that probably I won't be the first one to give this definition of sustainable infrastructure, and apparently this is one of the main problems and hurdles in delivering and cascading down and operationalize our big commitments when it comes to social and sustainable agenda. So at the same time, no one argues that sustainability is where the climate agenda meets the social agenda and economic growth. And we are in an era where population is growing rapidly, and it's already very challenging to balance those three dimensions. At the same time, those dimensions are interrelated and are competing for resources. Why infrastructure is important to be sustainable? Actually, I don't think that we should have any discussion about infrastructure that is not sustainable anymore. Infrastructure is at the core, at the center, and at the heart of all ESGs and at the Paris Agreement. It's not only SDG 9, it's all 17 SDGs that are delivered through infrastructure. We are living a tremendous momentum, if I may say, of global coalitions and tremendous financing, trillions of financing that is channeled into that will be channeled into infrastructure, and all those coalitions at the highest possible level, G20, G7, and at the COP level, they're talking about how we will manage to change the infrastructure environment around us, and how we will manage to change the trajectory of the existing model. So I'd like to mention that one of the greatest limitations, if I may say, that hold us back in delivering sustainable infrastructure is our inability, let's say, or our difficulty to be as agile and as flexible as possible. This is an environment, the infrastructure ecosystem is an environment that has been developed based and being dependent on predictability and stability. It's the robustness of the cash flows that make a project bankable, right? So by default, the infrastructure ecosystem is a prudent ecosystem. It includes organization. The organization that make this ecosystem have a very strong duty of care, if I may say, to their stakeholders. Those are the multilateral banks, the institutional investors, the governments, us, the private investors. So it's very difficult. It's not that easy always to change the mindset of this prudent, sometimes risk-averse environment. So how do we transform this? How do we change this and make this ecosystem more agile and prone to change? What we need to realize is that the risk profile of sustainable assets has changed. And we don't need to get into a situation where we need to realize that, because if we don't, we will be at the trap situation where for sustainable infrastructure will not be bankable, and infrastructure that is not sustainable will not be investment grade. So this is not a situation to be in. So I'll give an example. When I talk about changing risk profiles on infrastructure, I will talk about the example of resilience. As Charlotte mentioned at the beginning, infrastructure is responsible for 80% of the global CO2 emissions. At the same time, it is a sector that is most affected by climate change. So we've seen lately extreme weather conditions in Pakistan, in Florida, and I wonder whether sometimes we realize that the infrastructure system around us has been built a few years ago under the assumption that those adverse climate events are just an events of force majeure and acts of God. After all those years that we have been witnessing tremendous catastrophe when it comes to climate change, we have seen data that suggests that climate-related claims in infrastructure are the most expensive claims. And after all those reports coming from the UN, from IEA and ARENA, that say that things will only get worse, do we really think that the existing risk profile that is part of our contractual relationships with governments and infrastructure is still valid? Are those events still an act of God? And that means that either God hates us, right? Or we don't recognize that things have changed tremendously and climate risk has been greatly normalized and at a certain extent can be predictable. So what do we do to build, what do we do with this information? What we're missing mostly is having and articulating a business model that is robust, and so the robust business case of resilience and adaptation when it comes to infrastructure. Maybe we should start working we need additional data, and when it comes to data, insurance companies, if I may say, have a very strong data on performance and resilience of infrastructure when it comes to climate impact. So working together across sectors and building together a better business case, articulating the the return on investment when it comes to climate. This is how even the most prudent minds are changing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Isadora. More than 80% of the energy that we consume or we produce or we use is still linked to fossil fuels. So energy transition is key when it comes to sustainable infrastructure or adapting the infrastructure towards more decarbonisation. It's also key for ensuring energy security. So that would be my question to you, Mark. Which types of infrastructure assets must be targeting as a priority in this transition?
No, thank you, Charlotte. So first of all, I'm really honoured to be here as the token white middle-aged male. It's quite nice. Quite a change, I imagine. Sorry, back to the energy transition and efficiency and what we need to do. I mean, we have an energy system that's been built off burning stuff to generate the energy we need, and ultimately we've sort of got a society that's grown by accessing more calories for less effort. Now we need to get more out of those calories, and ultimately the fossil fuel system we've got is fundamentally not a sustainable one, as we see clearly from the impact on the environment. And arguably, you know, what do? We take engines, we burn fuels to make electrons to move us around. We've got a structure that's built up about taking fuels and transporting them to where we need. And for that to be sustainable, we need to change the whole infrastructure whereby we are harnessing energy from the environment and taking those electrons directly to meet our new needs. So back to the point, 80% of emissions are sort of fossil fuel based. And I think one way to consider it is it's sort of taken. If we consider the way we use energy in Europe, as an example, Northern Europe, about 20% of our energy is for electricity as we know it, 40% is for heat, and 40% is for transport. So we need to change all of that pie, and we're doing quite a good job on that 20%. We've got the transport and the heat side to change, and we effectively got to electrify that, and that means we need to change the entire delivery system and extractive system of burning stuff to one which is harnessing and effectively reshaping how we do it, ultimately in a much more efficient and sustainable manner, because we're not burning something and wasting the outcome. So therefore, efficiency is key. This electrical infrastructure is key, so that is going to rely massively on grids, on aspects to carry energy, to store energy. So there's all sorts of storage technologies. It's not just batteries. Excuse me. It's not just batteries, it's pump storage, other heat storage, and very diverse ranges. We need to have infrastructure to support our transport needs, and be that more power lines over the head for more buses, but also, of course, as everyone highlights, or we see all the time, EVs need charging infrastructure. So it's a big dynamic space, lots to do, huge investments needed to get to ultimately what would be a sustainable infrastructure to support our day-to-day needs.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So talking of transport, I'm going to turn to Anna. Transport is responsible for a quarter of the CO2 emission globally, but also the major part of the urban pollution. So obviously, the whole transport system needs to be adapted towards greener and more sustainable solutions. Anne, what is your view on the investment needed in the transport sector?
I'm going to give you a little bit of 30 seconds on TPG, which is the local bus and tram company. I don't know how many people around the world are following this session, but TPG is the local bus and tram company. It belongs to the state, but it's autonomous. Meaning we manage it with a board, with a separate board, separate management. The turnover is 500 million francs a year. Before COVID, that was about 50-50 from the canton and 50% from tickets. Now it's down to about 40% from tickets because we're not back to pre-COVID levels of passengers yet. 2,200 employees, only 14% of whom are women, but we're working on that for diversity reasons. 460 vehicles and about 160, post-COVID, 160 million rides every year, which means 600,000 to 700,000 people every day in an area which is about 1 million people total. So it's a big network and it's very, very complete. Charlotte asked for our thoughts. It's also an honor to be here, and I really enjoyed talking to Charlotte about preparing the whole thing. She had talked about revolutionizing urban transport, and I like this term very much because I have several comments on this. Revolutionizing doesn't always have to be high technology and very innovative. What part of transportation has to do is come back to models, different models, but similar models to what we've had in the past. And that's part of this transition and of this revolution. And she said urban transport, which I think is very, very broad, and that is as it should be, because TPG is just one piece of the puzzle of clean energy and how do we fit into the whole ecosystem of mobility, of transportation. So I have a couple of points to make and then we'll go on. But in clean energy, for example, TPG is 50% clean energy. 50% of our vehicles now are electric. Those
but
are
what would be these clean energies?
That's clean energy. It's hydraulic.
Electric.
In Switzerland, yes, electric. Those are the trams, obviously, with overhead lines, trolley buses with overhead lines, and the TOSA buses, which are an innovation, which was a PPP project between TPG and private partners and the state. So they also have arms going up and charging electricity, but it's flash charging. They charge in a minute while people are getting on and off the bus. So all of that are our electric vehicles. By 2030, we will be 100% electric. Second point I'd like to make is that part of the solution, and that's where TPG is part of it, is to develop public transport. It's one piece, but we have to develop it. And if I give you an example, I know a lot of you perhaps are coming from outside of Switzerland, but Geneva is the second city in Switzerland. Zurich is the first. Geneva transportation, about 22% of trips in Geneva are done on public transport, about 22, 23%. In Zurich, it's over 30%. So typically, we can increase trips on public transport by almost 50% before we even beat Zurich. And my goal, of course, is to beat Zurich. So, I mean, we have more to do. We have much more to do. And then some people say, but, you know, part of this whole clean energy development is other factors such as scooters and electric bikes. I think we have to stop making opposition between different types of mobility. We are not the enemy of bikes. Bikes are not our enemy. Scooters are not our enemy. They're not out to get you on the sidewalk. I mean, believe me, when I say this, it's really true. These are part of clean energy transportation, and these are things that will remain with us for a long time. So we have to organize space so that we have complementary transportation. This is a question I've had several times, won't electric cars solve a lot of our problems? Cars are the polluters. And I have one more point to make on cars. Cars are the polluters. We're going to 100% electric by 2030. If all of the cars go to electric cars, no problem. We don't have to do all of these other severe measures. If you look at the press in Switzerland, it drives me crazy because every article says electric cars are booming. This is true. Electric car sales are booming. And they give figures like 20, 30, 40% of all new vehicle sales in Switzerland are electric vehicles.
There's a ban by 2035, right? On
not in Switzerland for the moment. Not in Switzerland, but there's a strong encouragement.
Okay.
You know, we do things by consensus. So
a ban on fossil fuel vehicles in the rest of Europe.
But if I ask you, what is the percentage today of electric cars on the road in Switzerland? Would you say 5, 10, 20, 25%? Hearing these figures where 40% of new sales of new vehicles are electric vehicles. We are right now at less than 3%. Less than 3%. So in order to us to get to 2030 or 2035 or 2040, we're going to have to explode sales by much, much more every single year. So electric cars are not the solution. Besides the fact that we've just discovered that rubber from tires is almost as much a pollutant as emissions. So it's not a huge solution. So here's my last controversial, it shouldn't be controversial, but it is. The end of my little introduction is that what we really need for the next 10, 20 years is to get cars off the road. And I don't mean sell your cars. I don't mean everybody's on a bicycle or walking. I mean less trips in cars. 50% of trips across Geneva of less than 5 kilometers are by car. 50% of trips. Every single person in this room and in the audience, every single person can cut down by 1 or 2 or 3 trips a week. And I've just spoken to someone who's on her cargo bike with her kids. This is maybe the radical opposite, but it is something which is coming, which is developing very quickly, and it is very clean energy. So when we talk about moving people and transportation and mobility, we have to think about reducing space for individual cars. And what Mark said about the use of fossil fuels and how it's used in a car, it's something like, I'm sure you know this much better than I do, 60 or 70% of the energy from the fuel never gets to the wheels.
I think it's probably sub 5% efficient by the time you've extracted, refined, transported, and got to the wheel.
It's horrendous. It's horrendous.
We'll come back to that. Thank you, Anne. We'll come back to electrification for sure, but also to efficiency with you, Mark. I'd just like to have your view, JC, on obviously all this will be supported by regulatory framework and by targets and goals. So we're all aware of the 2050 net zero targets, the Paris Agreement goals. The very simple question, because we want this panel to be positive, would be, are these targets really achievable by 2050? Do you think we can achieve this net zero? And what scale, what speed, what are the efforts or supports that are needed?
Yes, they are achievable, and I'll say something about that, and I'll say something about how, and then I'm going to come back to Anne's revolutionary point, because that's part of the how. There is a path to achieve the net zero targets. First, let's be clear, some of those are carbon targets, some of them are all greenhouse gas emissions targets. It makes a difference. Some of those targets are mid-century, meaning in the European Union well before 2050, because rich countries are going to have to move further faster, and some of them are more like mid-century 2060 for China, 2070 for developing countries. So that net zero 2050 in fact encompasses a number of different metrics, dates and regions of the world, and it's quite important to watch that when you're looking at some of the commitments that countries are making. And we'll be discussing at Sharm el-Sheikh next month at COP27. There is a pathway. It's narrow, but it's feasible. And you will see this said when the World Energy Outlook is published by the International Energy Agency later this month. That narrowness, in some ways, I hesitate to call it an advantage, but it is a simplification. There are now so many no-regret, clear things to do that there's a lot less discussion, frankly. The path is narrow, we need to deliver on it, we need to deliver on it fast, and we need to deliver on it fast, particularly in Europe, where we have the wealth, but we also have to set the example for the rest of the world to follow. Because we've got to convince the rest of the world that a prosperous green economy exists. And it's Europe that they're looking to for that example, despite the new energy crisis circumstances of the last 6 months. And some of the headlines about those around the world are very, very worrying. Second key point. To do this, the most important thing we have to do, and to solve our energy security crisis in Europe, is build more renewables and do more energy efficiency. And again, Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency has said, look, if you'd done more of this over the last 10 years, you'd be in a better position in Europe today. Quite right. The most important message. Permit the renewables. Permit the electricity grids. Do the energy efficiency retrofits, particularly in the building sector. None of this stuff is easy. There's a reason we haven't done it yet, and a lot of it's going to involve politics, and some of that politics is at EU level, and some of it's at national level. And I'm sure that's a theme we'll come back to. But the third thing I wanted to say is, very roughly speaking, if you speak to a climate scientist, 1/3 of the mitigation actions, the emissions reduction actions that we need to take, can be kind of done in a way that's invisible to citizens. And a lot of those are to do with energy infrastructure, by the way. They cost money, they make profits, But I personally, in my lifestyle, am not going to notice them very much. 1/3 involve behavior change, but light behavior change. And that's where I would put taking public transport rather than driving a car. And I'm proud to say, yes, I arrived by bus here today, and I will be leaving by bus here today. I don't even have a driving license. It's a personal gesture to the green economy. The third kind is behavior change deep. And now we're talking diet. Eat less meat. Stop eating beef. Stop eating lamb. I'm afraid the animals emit methane. It's a forcing greenhouse gas. It's an urgent crisis. And retrofit your buildings for energy efficiency so that you use less energy. Whether that energy is Russian natural gas methane, or whether that energy is clean electrons produced by renewable systems and grids, it's still energy. The best form of energy, famously, is the negawatt, the energy you don't use. That deep behavior change, I have to say, worries politicians. They get much more comfortable talking about the upstream electricity grids that the citizens won't notice. And here's the statistic that's worried me most this year. Talking to the Dutch Research Institute in the Netherlands, TNO, 8% of the population lived in energy poverty before energy prices started going crazy. And that's quite a big number in a rich country, but it's manageable. Energy poverty defined as cannot pay your bill at the end of the month. 48% of the population, half the population of the Netherlands, lived in a capital investment trap. They couldn't afford to change their energy circumstances, put in new windows, insulate the roof, change the gas boiler for an electric heat pump. In other words, the capital investment that we're going to need in one of the richest countries in the world, which is, by the way, one of the ones that's going fastest down the path to electrification, is going to need a massive, massive investment intervention. Some of that's going to be public, some of it's going to be private. You people are much, much more expert on how to blend that than I am. But we are going to have to address the problem of capital investment into the building stock in Europe. And if we don't do that, we can't get out of the trap that we are now in with the Russian gas situation. And by the way, this winter might be tough. It looks like the weather projections are it's going to be cold. On a cold day, 35% of natural gas use in Europe comes out of storage. On a mild day, 20%. But we've got the storage full this summer. Next summer, we will have difficulty filling the storage. So next winter is going to be much harder. We're talking half a decade. We've got half a decade for you people to invest in wind turbines, grids, and energy efficiency in buildings, please.
Thank you, Jessie. We'll come back to private and public financing because I think that's key, obviously, to implement this new generation of infrastructure. But first, to go deep into the sectors and the assets that are needed, I want to go back to energy transition and electrification. So, Isidora, maybe you start. What do you think? Is electrification the only solution when it comes to energy? And to also jump on what Jessie said, obviously, how do we have this electricity greener or cleaner? Because electrification is only the solution if the electricity is produced with a green way.
So I'll try not to duplicate with Jessie because he mentioned a lot of important statistics and stats when it comes to the importance of electrification. So the short answer is yes, electrification plays a huge role in decarbonizing our environment. Our economies are very heavily dependent on fossil fuels, particularly on coal, oil and gas. Almost 80% of energy demand is met by fossil fuels. So at the same time, the whole energy system produces 2/3 of CO2 emissions. So energy demand those statistics, together with the fact that we have a huge population growth and energy demand is expected to double until 2050, and it's going to double in the developed economies, in the growing economies. Some people say it's going to be like five times higher or even 10 times higher. We understand that we are in a trajectory with a very strong impact, a negative impact to the environment. So there is a lot of increasing need for energy. We're not there yet to switch to renewables as quickly as possible, so that we are in a situation where we need an energy transformation that has the scale of the industrial revolution, but the pace of the digital revolution. So this is where we are now. So according to IEA, IRENA, and all those organizations, in order to avoid further increases in temperature, we need to move from 20% usage of clean electricity, which is today snapshot, to 50 or even 70%. If we reach those amounts, those same organizations say that we will be able to decrease CO2 emissions even by 70% until 2050. So this is a lot, and it's worth the effort. Coming back to infrastructure, as Jesse just mentioned, we need more projects on renewable energy, and at the same time, we need more investment on transmission infrastructure in order to be able to deploy efficiently the energy coming from renewables. The investments that are needed are massive. According to IEA, we're talking about an annual need of 4 trillion investments until 2050 for investment to infrastructure and also to technology when it comes to energy. And at your point, what is the next generation infrastructure? Under this massive energy transition, practically, that means that this is an infrastructure that is more electric, if I may say, and more efficient. It's the infrastructure that shows that we have managed to change our business model, to use electricity to heat our buildings, to operate our industries, and at the same time to move our vehicles instead of using fossil fuels.
Yes, okay. Thank you for that. Do you, well, maybe Mark first. So electrification necessary for the energy transition, and obviously that includes more renewable capacities, and we come back to that with you, Jesse, after on the financing of these renewable capacities. But Mark first, in the energy transition, you always say that it's not only new capacities or greener capacities, it's also energy efficiency. So what are the assets needed to become more efficient and or reduce consumption?
Thanks. So an electrical system is inherently more efficient than a fossil fuel system. And actually, whilst both Jesse and Isadora are talking, I'd suddenly sprung to mind the CEO of Scottish Power put very well the challenge to this decarbonisation challenge very well to me in terms of what lies ahead. It's taken us 20 years to decarbonise about 20 or 30% of our electricity demand. We've now got to decarb, and I mentioned earlier that about 20% of our energy demand is electricity in the way we think of it conventionally. We've now got 20 or 30 years to decarbonise everything else, so it's pretty big challenge ahead. Now, with regards to efficiency, if we do electrify everything, and to the point that was made that, of course, it's a growing world population, we're going to need more energy. What is great about these electric systems is they're much, much more efficient. An electric motor is 80–85% efficient, a battery similarly, versus, we discussed earlier, by the time you extract a fuel and stick it and it spins your wheel in your car, you're probably sub 5%. So the gross pie of energy may actually be way, way more efficient. And also to tackle that energy consumption, efficiency, as was touched on, I think, Jesse, you were mentioning it, it's in the buildings, it's the heat loss. So going forward, what is a sustainable infrastructure? A sustainable infrastructure does not stop just at grids. It's going to be coming up with models, financial models, and I think that's where policy needs to get involved to deploy that capital so that homes in, I think you said Denmark, did you, Jesse? Netherlands can actually, so the people there can actually pay or afford and have installed the energy efficiency needed for their homes. And so it's all about the business models to kind of make those homes, those offices, actually sustainable infrastructure assets as well as the grids. I think that's sort of...
Yeah, okay. So in the end, who's going to pay this bill? What is the role of policies? And do you think, Jesse, that we need more subsidies? Obviously, we're going for the private financing side, but I'm quite keen on understanding the public financing, the subsidies. How can you change that also and support this change, especially in the buildings, I guess, because industries, it's different.
Mm-hmm. Well, subsidies have been used a lot so far to get the renewables industry launched. We haven't used them as much in the building sector, and it certainly needs looking at. On the renewables, honestly, finance, to my understanding, is not the problem in Europe. If you can build a wind farm and get it operating, connected to the grid, generating, you can sell it for anything you like the next day. The issue is the permitting. And it's not just the permitting of the wind farm, it's the grid connection, it's the road connection, etc. It's the other way around the rest of the world, by the way. There, the permitting is possible, but the finance is difficult. When it comes to the signals that we send to the market, we're having a major debate about redesigning energy markets in Europe. Now, some of that's a reaction to the current crisis, but some of it's because we've realized that simply a commodity spot price plus a carbon price is not an adequate signal to drive clear investments. And that's certainly the case when you come to the building sector, because the payback is too slow. So we're going to need much more interventionist type policies. Are they subsidies? Are they tax breaks? Are they access to subsidized finance? You tell me. One comment. I think you can divide some of the issues around the finance into traditional business risk, which should be normal, and the sort of more systemic risks that we're now looking at. Policy change is happening very, very fast, as Isadora pointed out. We've got now, of course, not only the mitigation challenge of reducing emissions, but the adaptation challenge of living with climate change. We've already locked in a lot of climate change. Honestly, mitigation and adaptation are beginning to merge when it means infrastructure into one problem. So climate insurance. We are going to need help with that for the private sector, almost certainly from the public sector. The European Commission had its first expert group on this, to my knowledge, back in 2014, by the way. I was a member of it. So it's not that people haven't been thinking about this, it's getting the answers deployed. So something that would be very useful from a finance audience would be clarity about what you regard as normal business risks and what you regard as additional systemic risks that are intrinsic to the energy transition under climate conditions. Then have a discussion with the policymakers about that second set of risks, because there clearly the case for public intervention gets stronger.
Thank you. Back to electrification, transport, maybe Anne. So we started to discuss this new mobility and probably more and more mobility as a service. What investments, let's say, or assets are needed in terms of obviously urban mobility and also, well, yes, we can also discuss the importance of public financing our framework here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this question. It's very, very key. Patrick Audier, on the first day of this Congress on Monday, gave a speech in which he said how important it is to have a partnership between the political will and private financing. And this is what this Congress is all about, but we need to step that up. So I mentioned one project of the TPG, which was the TOSA bus, which was developed between public funds and private money from ABB, or private development from ABB. When people say there is a move afoot, it's almost a pun, about free transport, free public transport. And it's being talked about in Geneva, it's in play in Switzerland, it's in place in Luxembourg, it's in place in other cities. And this is considered by some people to be a panacea and a solution, part of the solution. Get people out of their cars. If you lower the price or make it free, supposedly free, and I'm putting that between quotation marks, then you can reduce emissions. And if I can just say a couple of words on that, because it ties everything you just said together. It's never free, number one. It's not free. Somebody is paying it, so thank you, taxpayers. But it has been put in place only in places where the government was paying almost 100% of the cost anyhow. So there was very little financing coming from the tickets. Well, as I said, before COVID, we were 50% ticket income. What happens when it's 100% financed by the state? I have the greatest respect for the state of Geneva, the canton of Geneva. They're very supportive of the TPG. But we do innovation based on what comes in, the money that comes in from tickets. The canton does not finance innovation. And this is as it should be. This is taxpayer money, it's not their money, it's money which should be used very wisely, and they don't do risk ventures. We have several risk ventures in TPG which we've entirely funded by ticket income. One of them is our autonomous vehicles. TPG is now a world reference, not just European, world reference for autonomous vehicles of public transport. We're on our third project. 2 of the 3 have been financed by the European Union. So that's already fantastic projects. We couldn't have done that because we contributed to financing as well. The second project is also very interesting. It's about more efficient use of energy. This is a project called TPG Flex, which is during the busy hours, during rush hour, there's a regular small bus which does a certain rural part of the Geneva Canton, and it does its regular route and stops at the stops if there are people there. Outside of those hours, the vehicle has it's called TPG Flex because it's on-demand transportation. So people call on an app, and the vehicle comes to get them. It's not an autonomous vehicle. The driver comes to get them. But there is an algorithm which provides that if there's one person on the way, the vehicle will arrange the route so that these people can be picked up efficiently. What this means partly is that it's more efficient. There's never an empty vehicle circulating, unless it's just to go to the first person. And on our route, of course, we have empty vehicles. At the end of the line or on very low hours, there are empty vehicles. They're using energy, whether it's electric or diesel. They're using energy. So this is one way also of reducing the use of energy in a certain way. And this is financed partly by subsidies, by what we get from the canton, but also from ticket money. So this public-private partnership is vital. It's absolutely, it's more than important. It's absolutely necessary for all of the services that have to be financed somehow through public money. So it's a combination, and we need that combination.
Okay, thank you. I want to come back to the app and digitalization, because I tend to think that digital transition is going to support this energy transition. What do you think, or Mark maybe, is our greener infrastructure assets going to be also more connected, or and I think of smart grids and smart meters. So digitalization is also supporting more efficiency and less consumption, but also digitalization implies more energy. So what do you think, and should the two be linked together and maybe also supported together by public entities?
Yeah, I think, and that's actually already well underway. And what's quite, I mean, if we just think back, if we've got an energy system that's going to be more reliable on renewables, that means a lot of the inputs on the energy availability are going to vary more, which means we need to be smarter in how we use that energy, which then leads us back to having smarter grids and smarter uses. And there's things like smart meters being deployed. They've been used for some time in industry. But it's fascinating what's happening there. You've got a combination of the generator's able to optimize some of their renewable assets by judging what's happening with weather ahead of schedule. Similarly with consumption, but also by having sort of smarter grids and price signals through the chain, spikes in power, the consumers of energy
on price, competing on capital costs. This is a huge limitation for the industry. It goes without saying that in an environment that we need to invest heavily at the beginning for resilience, for technology, for energy efficiency, competing on price only, and winning projects through huge discounts doesn't work. But the question is why we're doing that, right? Why everyone is so fixated to price? I'd like to be, devil's advocate and say that it's not that, government and project clients are not capable to deliver sophisticated bids. Maybe we should also think about ourselves, the private sector, whether we have achieved, whether we have managed or we have failed during all those times to identify a measure that is as transparent as price, because this is what is missing now. And maybe at the same time, we should make sure that governments, public authorities, procuring authorities are investing heavily in technical capacity to deliver infrastructure, but at the same time, ourselves, the private sector, should make better progress, if I may say, to measure and disclose ESG performance, to confidently assess life cycle carbon emissions in infrastructure, and at the same time to articulate a better business case to green processes when it comes to infrastructure, like the business case for circular economy, the business case for energy efficiency. This is what we're missing now. And although there's a lot of activity, a lot is brewing in the area, we need to make sure that there are measures that are highly endorsed. We don't need 100 different metrics when it comes to disclosing ESG performance, and we need to be more assertive and more confident in our business case for sustainability.
So that would be, for example, reporting on tons of CO2 avoided, or reduction of emissions, or the social also solutions to society. With the investment managers in infrastructure, most of their investors, they're large institutional investors, so they are really also keen on having very strict reporting on ESG criteria and not only financial criteria. And hopefully, Mark, I don't know if you see that also on the markets, but the markets more and more are going also to judge the corporates that are reporting on these ESG criteria. So we need this change in the performance and measurement of the performance.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the ESG agenda has rapidly escalated. I mean, I would argue that there's also some pushback at the moment on ESG. I think ESG is absolutely right. I think it's still also finding its way. It's like sort of accounting standards. The world changes, you try things, it needs to evolve, and people learn how better to measure and how better to judge and how to assess returns. I think ESG sort of rules, for want of a better term, also offer a route for companies, for investors to ascertain whether a company or an investment is going to end up being a stranded asset, which is a loss leader. And so I think that's kind of the direction where we're trying to get to. I mean, there are mistakes being made along the way, but it is heading that way. And certainly investors are increasingly focused on how companies are going to set out to achieve, and some of the legislators are moving to see if companies can disclose how, let's say, climate change is going to affect their business as a risk factor, which could then in turn affect how much finance certain companies can raise to deploy and invest. And so I think it becomes a virtuous circle as the systems and as the measurements evolve and deliver.
And also maybe when we discuss Geneva and TPG, well, obviously I think that Switzerland is a very good example, but it's also very particular, and it's, this example is difficult to export, but still you think that public financing shouldn't be seen as a cost or not profitable, or rephrasing the question, what would be the true cost of unsustainable infrastructure? Sorry.
TPG did in 2019, we financed an external independent study of what is the return on the cantonal investment in TPG to the canton. So obviously, it's difficult to calculate. It was very difficult for them. It's very detailed, it's very conservative. The result is positive. It's a positive 18% return. The difficulty there is that the money comes out of the canton, 50% of the money, or they're measuring really the return on the cantonal investment. So the money comes out of the cantonal pocket, but it doesn't go directly back into the cantonal pocket. This is less congestion, less pollution, less time spent, and an increase. Oh, let me just give you one figure on congestion. The Confederation, the Swiss Bern authorities measure the cost of congestion every year, and they calculated in 2021 that it was a cost of 1.6 billion Swiss francs, the cost to the country of congestion. This is huge. If we could cut down on that, that's a positive return. So to finish my little expose, they came up with 18% return. There is a report in the United States which is much more positive in the returns. But as I say, it's difficult to, because it comes out of one pocket and goes into another, this real estate value is a big positive. So to invest, all of you know probably that when the TGV was put into place in France, the value of real estate went up wherever there was a TGV, wherever the fast train went. That's well known, and it's in every ad now. It's, you know, how many kilometers from the nearest station. So that's something that the private sector could invest in, is real estate, which is on the site of future. It's already happening in Geneva. I mean, the fact that the tram extensions, the value of real estate goes up along that route. So once again, I'm mixing private and public financing, but that's the way we have to operate. And I think it's something that the private sector should think about as well. We talked about the return, the positive return. This is a positive return, but not directly for the canton. But if a company invests in something, they have to be able to measure it. I spent my whole life in finance. We have to be able to measure. There have to be indicators, there have to be labels that we can measure. And Mark has already said, I mean, there's a little bit of a backlash against ESG because there's no, universal way of measuring it. We don't know how to measure it yet. But we're working on it, and I think that public and private have to work together on these labels as well, and how we develop the labels, how we define the labels, and what that means for private investing.
Can I just interject? As I thought, I was reading a little while ago on your point on transport and the value in society. You made me think that the bicycle transformed society. People on average, I think, like to live no more than an hour's commute from work, and as transport has sped up and become more efficient, people have kind of moved away, which has changed the dynamics, the quality of life. We live further out. And I love this example of a bicycle years ago, where everyone used to live so close to industry, and it was polluting and it was unhealthy, and only the rich could afford to take a horse to work. And then along came the bicycle, and the working man or woman could also all of a sudden live a much better quality of life. So I think just I quite like that little analogy. By sorting out the transport, sustainable transport, you transform sort of quality of life.
Yeah, so...
Sorry, just one more line. When I talked about the revolution, sometimes we go backwards, I really meant the bicycle. The bicycle was invented in 1800 or 1820, but an electric bicycle is revolutionizing the transport world, absolutely revolutionizing. We never imagined at TPG, I wasn't there, but 10 or 15 years ago, who knew that an electric bicycle was a perfectly viable alternative to a bus. So they're our competition in a way, bicycles, but they're also extremely complementary.
So we need to transform the parking in the city centers into...
Can I talk about parking?
Yeah. You can. That's infrastructure. Okay. So how can we transform a parking into sustainable investments?
One of the ways of transforming urban transport is cutting down on free parking. It's been proven in study after study that if a car driver sits in traffic for an hour and a quarter, they will do that as long as they have free parking at the other end. 80% of the French people, we need them as workers, 80% of the drivers who come from France, 80% find easily a free parking spot, not paid, but free. So this is a campaign now of the canton is cutting down on free parking. Once again, free doesn't mean free. Somebody paid for it. Someone pays for it now. There's maintenance, there's upkeep, there's the construction of the parking space. So 80% also, comes out, this is the 80-20 rule, everything is 80-20, but 80% of companies in Geneva, in the canton of Geneva, still provide free parking for their employees. It's considered an absolutely necessary, essential perk, and it's not. It's an expense, and we have to change that. We have to change the structure remove free parking, charge it. I know what I'm talking about. We went to charging parking to drivers who come to Tipiger and take their service in 2015, and it was extremely painful. Extremely painful, and we are a sustainable, transportation company. So free parking has to be taken care of, and it is being done in Geneva.
Thank you, Jesse. Can we go back quickly to regulation, maybe, and this support towards sustainable investment and decarbonization, and probably then we can also check if there are some questions in the audience. But so the last question, the last point would be, what are the main challenges when it comes to regulation, and how can we accelerate these changes, because, well, time is also of the essence here.
Well, I spend my working life dealing with details of regulation and policy. And there's a very, very, very long list of stuff we need to update and fix. Some of it's a question of getting things out of the way so that things can happen. Some of it's a question of correcting the coefficients by which different kinds of energy solutions are compared, etc. But from your perspective, big picture, somebody mentioned at the beginning that we're looking for prudent, predictable, stable, reliable policy. I can tell you that's there. We have net zero targets in Europe. They are locked in, and they're locked in also by an EU climate law, which is virtually a constitutional document that will supervise the implementation and the pursuit of those targets and the adequacy of the policies to match those targets. Those sorts of climate laws are now very common in a number of EU member states, and they're monitored also by climate councils of scientific experts. We have a very clear switch. We used to live in a world where we used energy-dense molecules, coal, gas, oil, and we converted some of them to electrons for purposes for which we needed electrons, charging mobile phones, lighting. That is switching. The engineering is completely clear. We're moving to a world where we generate clean electrons and we convert those that we need into energy-dense, clean molecules for things like transport, sustainable aviation, etc. But the engineering switch is irreversible at this point. We're moving to a world where we are looking at capex-heavy investments. This is clearly very different from what we used to do and needs a bit of a rethink. My favorite pet at the moment is let's put in ground source heat pumps. In other words, geothermal. Very, very capex heavy because you've got to drill a lot of holes. The OPEX is almost zero to run. So let's think about how to do that. And the attitude in the capital markets is very clear. I heard recently from one of the very, very major ratings agencies that they now have a mergers and acquisitions database in which, sure, they look at the liabilities of a potential acquisition in terms of its pensions, but also its carbon liabilities. And these are now mapped and tracked and discussed in M&A discussions. So now you've got to get the business case right. That's where the regulation, I think the conversation can help most. Because you're absolutely right, it's not just price. Two very quick examples. Firstly, we talk about renewables as levelized cost of electricity, LCOE. The cost for the input for the cost of the electron that you get out. If you just look at the LCOE of a wind turbine, you put it in one place in a country, usually the windiest place. Ditto a solar panel, usually the sunniest place. That's crazy. You should be putting it somewhere that's reasonably windy and reasonably sunny, but that already has an electric grid connection, because the grid's the difficult bit. So start looking at what is now the most valuable real estate possible. It's land connected to electric grids. In other words, it's former power plant stations. That is perhaps how you should be calculating. And that's a real number that you can put into a real spreadsheet, I think. Second example, air source heat pumps, which we're all talking about, putting into buildings. If I just sell you an air source heat pump, you as the customer, I want you to be happy, I tell you it will go down to minus 15 degrees centigrade and you'll still be fine. That's a ridiculous specification in most of Europe. What I should be doing is selling you an air source heat pump and saying it'll go down to minus 5 degrees centigrade, but I'm selling it you together with an insulation package that will replace your windows and make sure that you won't need more than that minus 5 degrees centigrade. So change the business model, package the heat source with the insulation. And that's where you need to talk to us in the policy world, because we can write the policy incentives that make you think about looking at the grid locations, that make you think about looking at the business model packages. I know this all sounds very micro, but actually then you scale it up, and then you're looking at entire cities and entire electricity systems.
Is it fair to say that Europe is leading these changes? Do you think other countries are there too in terms of policies, regulation, but also in terms of investment in these sustainable infrastructure assets?
I think Europe is mostly leading, and we're certainly most determined. Some countries are getting other things right faster. Pretty much everything we need to do is being done right somewhere in the world, but just not at scale. There was a wonderful paper in Nature recently that looked at 18 countries that were getting 18 key mitigation actions right. I think 15 of them were in Europe. Some things are easier in different jurisdictions. Everybody talks about Singapore. Why? Singapore is easy. It's a national jurisdiction merged with a municipal jurisdiction. Inevitably, certain things are simpler there than they are in complex federal systems of major countries. But broadly speaking, Europe is in the lead, but not nearly fast enough. To put it in one line, we've got to stop throwing the dice and throwing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've got to throw 6, 6, 6, 6 on every single decision, every policy indication, every investment, if we're to hit our targets, and the world is watching.
Thank you. Maybe before we all conclude, and I wanted to ask or check if there are any questions in the audience for our panel today. Thank you. And please feel free to jump in the questions.
Thank you very much indeed for a great panel. My name is John Tidmarsh from Vi Capital. My question is, if you were to accelerate the massive investment that's required to make this transition, where are the opportunities? And where does that capital have to go?
Energy.
Okay, I'll step in and let someone else jump on. I mean, where are the opportunities? I mean, they're pretty diverse, and it depends what your risk profile is. So there's some great companies out there that are doing some really innovative early stage work in, let's say, hydrogen, also in sort of battery technologies. Their battery is arguably becoming sort of de-risked. And so I think what's quite nice about the maturity of the energy transition space now is that subject to whether you want really low risk, if you want really low risk, you go to regulated utilities who are doing all the right stuff and you know the return, and they're very sort of infrastructure orientated. And if you want some sort of sex and violence in your portfolio, you go to those early stage companies who are really doing super innovative stuff. And it may work, it may not. But I think one very important point I would like to make on this whole transition is I'm not the only one to have this view, and I really do ascribe to this view, is that if we're trying to get to net zero by 2050, we shouldn't be counting on technologies that are as yet that don't yet exist. I read a study that said, from the time something appears in Nature journal saying, look, we've got this wonderful new battery technology, to the time it's actually commercialized is 20 to 30 years. So if we want to deliver on net zero, we have to do it with what we have today. So I hope that answers your question. Maybe someone else has. No?
I've seen other hands. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I was interested in what our friend from the TPG said regarding sometimes the answer is not in innovation. And I was wondering, I think that sometimes the problem is not as obvious and the solution is not as obvious, but it's simple. So one of the problems, someone mentioned children, I believe. One of the problems that that is connected with people not using public transportation but using cars is safety. Families want to have their children driven by cars because there's a safety issue on public transportation and outside on the streets. And so one of the potential resolutions to this, to invest in, would possibly be having a separate or a section of each bus and tram and public transportation vehicle that is exclusively for children, and that has a person there who is sort of like a chaperone. It's not an innovative, it's not a digital solution, but that's a solution that would need to then be organized, and people would need to be trained, etc., etc. What are the chances that this type of non-digital solution is sexy and will have a financial, let's say, return by the investors?
It's already done. TPG manages a lot of school buses, and even to the extent at a certain age, teenagers are turbulent, and we have mediators on the buses so that they can calm things down if there's some kind of an altercation between the riders or the teenagers and the drivers. I would suggest to you that the risk to a child on public transport is multiple times lower than the risk to a child on a street. And the fact that we've all internalized women and men standing by the side of the road, dressed in high visibility clothes, leaping out into the street with a flag to stop cars in front of schools. How weird is that when I describe it like that? That's where the risk is. We're talking about in front of schools, and drivers have to be stopped physically. So I suggest that really the problem is, yes, there are certain risks on public transport, but it's so much less than on the street. And I think Paris, for example, has just announced, Paris is doing amazing things in urban planning. And one of the things is that the mayor is closing streets. When I say closing streets, closing to car traffic, and closing it permanently to car traffic wherever there is a school. This is revolutionary. It's not digital. It's just, it's common sense. How did we get into this car-dominant mentality where we all believe it? We believe that the car has priority. And we step out onto a pedestrian crossing, then I'll shut up because I really get on with this. But, really, we step onto a pedestrian crossing with fear. We're supposed to catch their eye so that they deign to stop for us, and we wave to thank them because they didn't kill us. Is that really the model? Seriously? So I just suggest that in urban planning, we have so many non-digital things to do. We have lots of digital things to do. We're still in the middle of lots of digital things in clean energy, in the way we distribute, the way we produce it, the way we use it. But we really have so many non-digital things that would change our lives and change the lives of our children.
Thank you. Well, I have to say we're still positive on EV chargers, but that will be the next debate. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this great event. I'm Pierre Husser. I work for Asteria Investment Manager in Geneva. And I have a question about, you mentioned the trillions per annum, 4 trillions of private investment that needs to come from the private sectors, and the public sector money won't be sufficient to plug the financing gap. Could you maybe explain a bit more what are really the key features of investing into infrastructure, and how interesting it can be on the financing side, performance, aside from the positive impact and the social benefit it provides for the society, but also for the climate? Because I'm sure there might be some private investors in the room, and they may be used to invest in the listed stocks and bonds, but perhaps also the private market is the key enabler as well to scale this energy transition through infrastructure.
While I give my investor colleagues time to think, I was given an exercise to do with my students years ago, and I still do it. I asked them to look up the oil price over the last 25 years. Crazy zigzags. Then I asked them to look up the dividend price of some of the European oil majors. And then I say, who is in control of these companies? Clearly, it's the shareholders. Who are the shareholders? The major pension funds. What are their plans? I won't name the company, but there's a company who I know very well have had long discussions with their major pension fund shareholders saying, listen, we are an energy company. We're telling you the energy transition is coming. We're telling you that we want to invest in electrification, that we understand these technologies, that we've been around for 100 years, we're an intelligent company, we know where to go. Please let us make those investments. Yes, the dividends will be more silver than gold for a while, but that's what you need to let us do. The pension funds are saying, we like the gold. Now, eventually the pension funds are going to have to look somewhere else. And I think that crunch point is coming. And I also think that those who have gone out and looked for the sort of silver dividends from the electrical specialists have also already probably eaten up most of the shareholdings in that market. In other words, if you wanted electricity shares, you've probably already bought them in NL. The question is now, what do you do about your oil and gas shares?
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
Is that TPG is very proud right now because we issued a green bond 2 weeks ago. And it's the first green bond issued by an autonomous public entity in Switzerland. So that's also a market that has to be developed very quickly. We issued a bond, not a green bond, but we issued a bond 7 or 8 years ago. It was placed in 15 minutes. And now we issued a green bond. I think it took the better part of the day to place it. But I mean, there's a huge demand. And I understand that demand. And the requirements for issuing a green bond are very severe. So, I mean, we had to go through a lot of hoops. But that's appropriate. I mean, it should go to green investments and it should be controlled, and there should be something which is a very major way of checking that it is actually green investments. So I think we need a massive push into green bonds.
When it comes, coming back to private investments, I think that in infrastructure, if you want to also see the attractiveness of infrastructure in a portfolio, the asset class used to offer predictability and some visibility on the cash flows, some kind of resilience towards downturn. But now also when it comes to all this next generation of infrastructure, we can find in infrastructure, in this asset class, needs for deployment and growth and value add. So it's even more attractive, I guess, today when you want to invest in this new generation of infrastructure because you have the growth coming and hence more returns also.
And
you go, please.
And at the same time, instead of focusing on different sectors when it comes to investment in infrastructure, perhaps we should also take into consideration which are the capable project owners out there, which are the companies, either private or public sector, that are able to deliver sophisticated infrastructure, flexible and agile. And we have a good example here in our panel. So probably those are the type of investment that we need to make, identify which are those companies. We have like utilities companies, water utilities in the UK that are doing a great job in delivering complex infrastructure projects in Australia. So probably that's another aspect that we should take into consideration, because those will be our partners in the long term, and those will be our partners when we're dealing with stress tests coming from changes.
I was just going to, I think, as an observation on a near-term basis, which I think is supportive that the capital is there to get involved. Right now, there is huge uncertainty in markets. Tech, for example, has been a darling for the last decade or longer and has been fantastic for returns, and it remains a great sector. But ultimately, for investors that are thinking longer term and trying to look past this, where do we go? Where is the uncertainty? No, where do we go for certainty? Where do I manage the pension money going forward? Infrastructure assets really lend themselves very well to that sort of appetite. It's like, here we go, you've got a 15, 20, 30, 40, 50-year asset. You kind of know what the returns are going to be. And right now, I think people really would like that than having this complete massive uncertainty on a near-term basis. So I don't think... and to add to that, this sort of insecurity of energy that we see today emphasizes that point. You know, economies can't function if there's not enough energy. That's the key denominator in an economy. And so if you don't fix that, nothing else is really worth that much. So I think the incentive's there. We have some turbulence to get on if you're just thinking pure equity markets. But I think from an infrastructure, from raising green bonds, there's no shortage of appetite as far as I can tell, even in a higher rate environment. So I think the capital is there. And I'm actually pretty optimistic to where we will be in a few years' time. The next few months is a little bit fiddly.
Okay, well, I've asked our speakers that we end with a positive final note, each of you. So maybe we can start with you, Jessie. How would you conclude?
I work in the field of climate change, so actually it's very difficult to be positive. It's really difficult. I was at COP26, and I spent half my time with political leaders. Great announcements, 90% of global GDP now covered by net zero targets. Fantastic. 30 years ago, I'd have been really excited by that. And the other half of my time I spent with climate scientists, who were in a very, very dark mood. Because as far as they're concerned, these are nice words on a piece of paper. But the emissions curve is doing what the emissions curve is doing. And they think that policymakers will do some creative accounting round about the date 2030. What everybody was asking is what a private market's going to do. Are they going to believe the targets? Are they going to fall in and try and seize the opportunities? It's a very, very different situation from when I was at Copenhagen in 2009 or even at COP21 in Paris in 2015, because the technology situation is now so much clearer. All the stuff that we can do that's green, yes, that's complex, yes, that's heterogeneous, yes, that therefore needs the digital coordination, is available. And it's cheap. So why aren't we doing it? My best guess, and this is me trying to be optimistic, is that I think we haven't had enough conversations and we don't understand one another well enough. So please, my note of optimism is, let's have more of the conversation with the energy specialists, the energy policy specialists, and the different groups from the investment community, and I'm not going to reveal my ignorance by trying to name any of them, all in the same room together, because I think what we will find is that we converge on quite a narrow set of common conclusions, and at that point, we're in a wonderful position for action.
I'll try to remain more positive. Because, I mean, especially in financial markets, they operate under the positive outlook, the positive perspective, and this activates us a bit easier. So I'd like to highlight that what we didn't have like 5 years ago, it's all this activity brewing around initiatives at the highest level, when I mentioned earlier on investments and on initiatives on sustainability. For the first time, there is no single region in the world that doesn't have climate at the top of their agenda, on different levels though, but still that is a reality. And the only thing that I guess we're missing in order to accelerate those efforts is to collaborate better, because as Jessie mentioned, everything that needs to be done exists somewhere in a jurisdiction, but it's not at scale because we are not collaborate at the right level and as much as we should do. So this is what we should be focusing on and try to understand what is happening out there, share best practice and scale best practice in a way that is mainstream and is not only a lighthouse example.
I think from my side, if I try and draw out a positive out of the current negative of this energy crisis, is that the aspirations of delivering on climate change and adopting renewables has been based on a longer-term goal that's conceptually quite hard for people to kind of realize and react upon on a day-to-day basis. We want to, we desire to, and with this energy crisis that predates the conflict in Ukraine, which then exacerbated it, it moved the dialogue, I personally think, from being one of a necessary, an essential goal, but one that is long dated, to a near-term economic imperative. And then the unfortunate conflict has heightened that risk and just shows how beholden we are on an energy basis. So it's about having our own independence and energy security. The energy transition is about having independence, reliable, and energy security in our domestic economies. So where we're getting to, I think, is a much better place, but it's going to be tough.
I will end with something very positive because it's very concrete. Geneva is the Geneva area of 1 million people across the border in France and the canton of Geneva and part of Vaud. This is a very dynamic economic area and has been for several decades. It's very dynamic. It's strong economic growth in a European framework. And for the last 10 or 15 years, I don't remember exactly the date, but for the last 10 or 15 years, we have decorrelated energy use from economic growth. And I think that's huge. That's before right now, when it's a crisis level. This is a long slog of incentives and measures taken and persuasion, etc., and digitalization. So, I mean, this is a very concrete example. It's real, and I think it will accelerate. So that's my very real optimistic story for the end.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, the audience. And we could stay for hours, but we'll be back. Thank you.